It began as a hushed exchange behind the controlled corridors of Kensington Palace, where silence is maintained by habit, but secrets rarely stay buried for long. Reports suggest Princess Catherine had just concluded a closed-door briefing with senior household coordination staff when an unexpected staffing decision began circulating through internal channels. What unsettled courtiers was not the decision itself, but the unmistakable authority behind it, a move made without consultation that sent quiet shockwaves toward Queen Camilla's inner circle. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed inside the palace was not noise, but a carefully contained disturbance that only those closest to the machinery of royal administration could fully sense. Within hours of the briefing, a new household appointment began appearing in restricted internal updates, tied to a trusted operational role within Catherine's immediate working environment. It was not framed as a public announcement, nor dressed in ceremonial language. Instead, it emerged through the quiet channels of coordination staff, the kind of procedural space where influence is often measured more by timing than by title. Yet what made this moment different was the absence of expected consultation. Traditionally, even minor staffing changes would pass through a web of advisory alignment between Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. This time, that chain appeared to bend, if not break entirely. Courtiers who observed the shift later described an immediate tightening of atmosphere, particularly among those aligned with Queen Camilla's administrative structure, as though an unspoken boundary had been crossed without warning. In the hours that followed, the reaction was not open confrontation, but something far more unsettling inside royal life, controlled silence paired with rapid interpretation. Those familiar with the rhythm of palace operations noted how quickly conversations were redirected, how staff were advised to remain non-speculative, and how internal queries were met with unusually precise deflections. Yet beneath that discipline, the narrative began to form on its own. Some described the move not as routine staffing at all, but as something strategic in nature, a deliberate recalibration of influence embedded within the household's operational core. The language of ceremony gave way to the language of structure, and with it came an uncomfortable realization among senior aides. This was not simply about who had been appointed, but about who now had the authority to appoint without asking permission. But what appeared at first to be a simple staffing adjustment was soon interpreted as something far more deliberate, a recalibration of influence inside the royal household itself. Within the royal household, staffing is never treated as a simple matter of employment or routine administration. It is architecture, carefully constructed and fiercely protected, where every appointment quietly reshapes access, influence and proximity to the crown itself. Reports suggest that Catherine's recent move disrupted this delicate framework, unsettling the long-established operational bridge between Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace. What appeared on the surface as a standard internal hire is increasingly being interpreted as something far more consequential, reaching deep into Queen Camilla's established household network and disturbing hierarchies that had remained stable for years. Inside the monarchy, staffing structures function less like modern organizations and more like layered systems of controlled proximity. Who speaks to whom, who filters decisions, and who is allowed into the inner administrative flow can determine influence as much as title ever could. Over time, a subtle but highly structured overlap had formed between Kensington and Buckingham operations, especially in areas of communications, scheduling, and ceremonial coordination. This overlap was never accidental. It evolved through tradition, trust, and carefully negotiated boundaries between households that, while united under the crown, often operate with distinct internal rhythms. Within Queen Camilla's inner household network, that rhythm has long been described by insiders as tightly coordinated and tradition-driven, shaped by a preference for continuity and established channels of approval. Every adjustment, no matter how small, typically moves through familiar lines of consultation, preserving a sense of order that reinforces stability at the highest level. It is precisely this structure that makes any deviation instantly noticeable. Reports suggest that Catherine's recent staffing decision, whether intentional or procedural, appeared to bypass some of these expected pathways, creating a momentary disruption in the otherwise predictable flow of administrative communication. At the same time, Catherine's own operational independence has been increasingly noted in recent years, particularly as her role within the monarchy has evolved into one of greater visibility and structured responsibility. Her household, while still aligned with broader royal protocol, has developed a reputation for efficiency and internal decisiveness, often streamlining processes that once required extended consultation. This shift, subtle but consistent, has gradually redefined how her office interacts with the wider royal system, allowing for faster internal movement, but also introducing new points of friction where traditional structures expect prior alignment. It is within this overlap between tradition and efficiency, between established hierarchy and emerging autonomy, that tensions naturally begin to surface. Staff positioned between both households have reportedly found themselves navigating increasingly complex communication pathways, where scheduling decisions, protocol confirmations, and internal approvals occasionally reflect differing expectations. What might appear externally as administrative detail is, within palace operations, the very mechanism through which influence is measured and maintained. Even slight deviations in process can carry symbolic weight, especially when they affect how two major household systems interface with one another. Observers within royal circles have begun to quietly describe what they call a silent rivalry, not expressed through confrontation, but embedded within the administrative layers themselves. It is a tension defined less by personal conflict and more by structural interpretation: how authority is exercised, how decisions are initiated, and how influence is acknowledged without being formally declared. In this environment, even a single staffing adjustment can ripple outward, reshaping perceptions far beyond its immediate function, and prompting renewed attention to the balance of power that underpins daily royal operations. And it was precisely within this fragile system of influence that the first fracture began to appear. The appointment itself, according to palace-adjacent accounts, was not announced with ceremony, but instead confirmed through quiet internal circulation channels that bypassed the expected layers of formal approval. There was no public framing, no traditional advisory alignment, only a sudden administrative acknowledgement that a new household staff member had been placed within Catherine's operational structure. What unsettled those observing closely was not just the decision, but the subtle origin of the name involved. Reports suggest the selected individual carried prior associations within Queen Camilla's broader operational sphere, a detail that immediately transformed what should have been routine staffing into something far more politically sensitive. Courtiers later described the atmosphere as shifting instantly, as if an invisible boundary long respected, rarely tested had been crossed without warning. In royal administration, even the smallest deviation in process is rarely dismissed as coincidence. The lack of ceremonial confirmation meant there was no shared moment of institutional acknowledgement, no synchronized approval between the interconnected household offices. Instead, information arrived fragmented, moving through restricted communication channels at different speeds, creating confusion within Buckingham coordination offices that depend heavily on precision timing. Some staff reportedly struggled to reconcile the appointment with established protocol pathways, questioning not just the decision itself, but the manner in which it had bypassed conventional consultation. In an environment where structure defines legitimacy, the absence of structure became its own statement. As the details circulated more widely within internal networks, attention quickly shifted from the identity of the appointee to the implications behind the move. Catherine's household team, already noted in recent years for its increasing efficiency and operational independence, now appeared to be functioning with an even sharper sense of autonomy. Decisions that once required extended alignment across multiple advisory layers were increasingly being handled within a more contained internal framework. This evolution, while subtle, was not unnoticed. It began to reshape how other royal departments interpreted her office, not as simply responsive, but increasingly self-directed within its defined authority. At the same time, the alleged connection between the appointee and Camilla-associated operations introduced an additional layer of sensitivity. Even indirect overlap in staffing history can carry symbolic weight within the monarchy, where perception often travels faster than procedure. Questions began to surface quietly within administrative conversations about whether proper consultation channels had been fully observed. Yet these were not formal objections, far from it. They were cautious inquiries, carefully worded, reflecting the delicate balance required when addressing anything that touches multiple household structures simultaneously. In such moments, even uncertainty becomes a form of influence. What emerged from this convergence of timing, association, and procedure was not a direct challenge, but a shifting perception. Some within palace-adjacent circles began to interpret the appointment not as an isolated staffing decision, but as part of a broader recalibration of internal positioning. The language used in private discussions grew more measured, less about who was appointed and more about what the appointment represented. Catherine's office, already seen as increasingly streamlined, now appeared to be asserting a level of procedural independence that subtly redefined its relationship with other senior households. And yet, despite the growing tension beneath the surface, there was no confrontation, no formal objection, no public acknowledgement of concern. What developed instead was something far more intricate within royal life, an atmosphere where silence carried as much meaning as speech, and where every unspoken reaction became part of a larger interpretation. Within that silence, the implications of the appointment began to expand far beyond staffing itself, setting the stage for a far more calculated response unfolding just beneath the surface of royal order. Inside Queen Camilla's inner circle, reaction was reportedly immediate but carefully contained, as if every word spoken had to pass through invisible filters before being allowed to exist. No public disagreement surfaced, no formal objection was raised, yet within private channels the tone shifted noticeably. Conversations were no longer focused on what had happened, but on what it meant. And that distinction carried weight, because this was no longer about a single staffing appointment, it was about precedent. If one household could act with this level of independence, then the long-established rhythm of influence between senior royal offices may already be changing in ways no one was prepared to openly acknowledge. Within those private advisory spaces, concern did not present itself as panic, but as calculation. The emphasis quickly turned toward structure, toward the invisible architecture that governs how decisions travel across the monarchy. Reports suggest senior aides began re-examining how staffing visibility had been managed in recent months, quietly mapping where consultation had been expected and where it had not occurred. It was not a reaction driven by emotion, but by the recognition that even small procedural deviations can reshape authority over time. In royal systems, control is rarely lost in a single moment, it is eroded through accepted exceptions. As discussions deepened, attention shifted toward internal safeguards, particularly those that govern communication flow between Buckingham-linked departments and the broader household network. Channels that were once flexible began to tighten, not through formal announcement, but through subtle procedural reinforcement. Requests required additional confirmation. Informal approvals began to carry less weight. Even routine acknowledgements were being revisited with renewed caution. The change was not dramatic enough to be publicly visible, but within administrative circles, it was unmistakable. Something foundational was being quietly reinforced. Courtiers later described the atmosphere during this period as controlled unease, a state where nothing is openly broken, yet everything feels slightly out of alignment. There was no confrontation, no breach of protocol that demanded escalation, but there was a growing awareness that influence inside the royal system was becoming more distributed than expected. And with distribution came uncertainty. Who initiates decisions, who validates them, and who merely observes them? These questions began to carry more weight than the decisions themselves. At the center of this unease was a deeper realization. Decision-making autonomy was no longer moving in predictable directions. Catherine's household, already noted for its operational efficiency, was increasingly being viewed through a different lens, not as an extension of established coordination, but as a unit capable of independent procedural momentum. That perception alone was enough to alter how other households began to interact with it, not through resistance, but through recalibration. Every message, every approval line, every staffing reference began to carry a second layer of interpretation. Yet even as these internal adjustments took shape, there was no outward sign of fracture. Everything remained contained, polished, and formally aligned. But beneath that surface, the balance of influence was being quietly reassessed in real time. And while Camilla's inner circle focused on precedent and control, a far broader awareness was beginning to form elsewhere inside the institution, one that would soon bring this silent shift into sharper, unavoidable focus. What emerged next was not confrontation, but recalibration. As whispers spread through administrative corridors, senior royal figures reportedly began informal inquiries not into the appointment itself, but into its authorization pathway. In royal operations, process is power, and even the smallest deviation can echo far beyond its origin. The move attributed to Catherine was increasingly interpreted as something larger than staffing alone, prompting quiet scrutiny from advisors aligned with both Prince William's structured oversight and Princess Anne's uncompromising emphasis on procedural discipline. Very quickly, attention shifted away from what had happened and narrowed sharply onto how it had been allowed to happen in the first place. Within these internal discussions, the language of concern evolved into the language of systems. It was no longer about personalities or individual decisions, but about the integrity of approval chains that hold the entire institution together. William's advisory circle reportedly began mapping the implications of recent staffing flows, not as isolated events, but as patterns that might signal shifting autonomy within household operations. At the same time, echoes of Princess Anne's long-standing insistence on procedural discipline resurfaced in background conversations. Her influence felt not through presence, but through principle, reminding all sides that stability in the monarchy is maintained through structure, not spontaneity. And as scrutiny deepened, the situation evolved from administrative curiosity into structured institutional response. Palace systems reportedly began reinforcing procedural checkpoints across household operations almost in real time. Approvals that once moved with quiet efficiency now required layered verification. Consultations multiplied. Cross-checking between departments became more frequent, more deliberate, and noticeably more cautious. What had once been a seamless flow of internal coordination now carried the weight of added scrutiny, as if every decision had to pass through an invisible second opinion before being accepted. Even without public acknowledgement, staff within these networks felt the shift immediately. Documentation requirements grew heavier, communication cycles slowed. Routine confirmations began to carry unexpected formality. It was not disruption in the traditional sense, but reinforcement and institutional tightening designed to reassert centralized procedural control without ever naming the cause that triggered it. In royal governance, such recalibrations are rarely explained because they are meant to be felt, not announced. Yet even as these systems tightened and structure was quietly reinforced, the underlying question remained unresolved and increasingly sensitive. Because beneath all the procedural adjustments, one reality lingered unspoken: the balance of decision-making itself had been tested, and the monarchy had responded not with confrontation, but with control disguised as stability. At the center of it all, King Charles III reportedly found himself navigating yet another layer of institutional strain, one that arrived quietly but carried unmistakable weight. With ongoing health concerns already narrowing the scope of his daily involvement, every internal shift within the royal household seemed to echo louder than before, as though the entire structure had become more sensitive to even the smallest adjustment. Sources suggest the staffing dispute was never treated as an isolated event, but rather absorbed into a wider recalibration of influence spreading across multiple household operations. The challenge, increasingly, was no longer about administration alone. It had become about maintaining equilibrium between competing centres of authority that all operated under the same crown, yet not always in the same direction. In this fragile environment, King Charles was reportedly forced into a position of constant balancing, where even routine decisions carried symbolic weight. The monarchy's internal ecosystem, already complex, now demanded even greater mediation between senior advisory circles, each interpreting developments through the lens of institutional stability. His reliance on senior advisors deepened, not as a matter of preference, but necessity, as pressure mounted to ensure that no single household appeared to dominate or drift too far outside expected alignment. What made the situation more delicate was not visible conflict, but the fear of visible imbalance, because in royal life, perception often becomes reality faster than any formal statement can correct. As these tensions accumulated, the underlying priority shifted toward preservation. Every adjustment, every quiet consultation, every procedural reinforcement began to serve one central purpose: preventing fragmentation from becoming visible. The monarchy, in essence, was not reacting to a crisis in open form, but carefully absorbing subtle shifts before they could harden into public narrative. And in that silent management of competing forces, a resolution slowly began to take shape not through confrontation, but through restructuring, designed to absorb tension rather than amplify it. In the end, no public statements were issued, and no formal disputes were acknowledged. Yet within palace systems, the effects were unmistakable. The staffing appointment attributed to Catherine remained in place, but it now operated under refined oversight structures, carefully designed to ensure alignment across interconnected households. Observers describe it not as a victory or a defeat, but as something far more characteristic of the monarchy itself: recalibration. A quiet, controlled adjustment that preserved outward unity while subtly redrawing the internal boundaries of influence. No dramatic rupture, no public fracture, only the silent mechanics of balance being restored in real time. And so, beneath the polished silence of royal tradition, the true story is never about a single appointment, but about how influence is quietly measured, adjusted, and ultimately preserved. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.